Hi, Econ 345. Welcome to our last and final lecture, because remember, after the break, we're moving to student presentations in the synchronous format. Wow. So before we even get into it, I just want to let you know it's been such a pleasure to teach you all this semester. I've really enjoyed it. We've had such great discussions, and we have made the best of the environment that we've had. So thank you all for being wonderful students that I have absolutely enjoyed. And though this is the last one of the lecture contents, there's still going to be review videos for the exam. There's going to be homework videos. We have our synchronous pieces online, but I just want you to know it's been awesome. Okay, so with that, I'll stop with the sappy stuff. Let's continue on into the lecture. So today we're on taxes and corporate income and welfare, right? So we spent a lot of time into the background of taxes. What are taxes? What do they actually mean? What do they look like? How can they have distributional effects? Then we started to go more specifically into personal income taxes. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the business and wealth type of taxes. So let's go ahead, screen share, and get right on into it. So I want to motivate this with a recent policy change. You'll actually hear more about this during the student presentations because one of you picked this for a topic. But the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So in 2017, Donald Trump signed into law a giant overhaul of the corporate tax system. So these are the tax rates that incorporated businesses get. It reduced the tax rate from 35 to 21%, or at least the top tax rates, moved to a territorial system, which means firms are only taxed on profits they earned in the US, not profits that they earn globally. Then unincorporated business owners were given large tax breaks to partially match those of their corporate counterparts, because you can either have, remember, in an unincorporated firm, which means that you are financially liable in case there's a lawsuit or a business failure, versus a corporated or incorporated business, which your personal assets are not on the line, right? If the business fails, you lose the business, but they're not coming for your house and your car. So there was tax cuts for this unincorporated business group so that they could also have tax breaks. The bill reduced projected corporate tax revenues by about $644 billion over the next decade in our projections. So what were the main arguments here? Well, there was a lot, right? Some people viewed this as great because they thought there was a relatively high U.S. corporate tax rate. They thought this was a barrier for businesses. They believed that this would help increase competitiveness of U.S. companies abroad because they would be able to make and supply and sell their goods for cheaper prices. Others kind of pointed out that though the top U.S. corporate tax rate was 35% because of different loopholes and because of how marginal tax rates differ from effective tax rates, the effective tax rate was actually about 24%. So this reduction could cause severe cutbacks on tax revenue that was coming in. So opponents believed that it was unlikely that the movement to this territorial tax system would lead to more U.S. jobs. And that was interesting, right? Because we had people on both sides of the aisle who were really debating this. So I give you this information because I want to kind of set the foundation for what corporate income taxes really mean. So when we're starting to talk about what these levels should be, we don't necessarily talk about, what should they pay? It's, if there's tax revenue coming in from the source, how much do we need and what is it going to fund? How do we encourage employment within the United States? How do we encourage business ownership? And all these different sorts of things. So when we debate corporate tax levels, there's more than one voice in the conversation. So what are corporations and why do we tax them? So you can either be incorporated or unincorporated. If you're unincorporated, like I said earlier, that means that your personal assets can be taken in the event of business failure or lawsuits or things like that. You are not separate from your company, so therefore it acts as one entity. If you're incorporated, so if this business is incorporated, it acts as its own legal entity. That means if it sues or fails, your personal assets are not on the line. What that does mean, though, is that when this business makes money, that money is taxed at the corporate income rate. Then you write a check to yourself if you are the business owner, and then you get personal income taxes. So that same dollar might end up being taxed twice, but there's a separation in between you and this corporation. Most production occurs in firms that are owned by many shareholders, right? So lots of people do decide to incorporate. When they incorporate, they typically get shareholders, which are just people who kind of purchase an ownership stake in the company. This gives the company money to work with. It helps them expand and grow and be able to invest money into research and development or projects. But these shareholders, they own a bit of that company. They own their little small chunk of that company and can receive dividends or profits along with it. So having many shareholders spread the risk of ownerships across many people, right? So that's not just one person who might lose money if the business fails. It's lots of different people who own parts of the company. So if the business fails, everybody loses a little instead of one person losing everything. So there's two different types of incorporated businesses. We have our S Corps. So these are the ones that generate income that is treated like personal income. This is more our unincorporated case. And then we have C Corps. These are the corporations. They're the ones that are incorporated, and the income that's taxed under these are taxed at the corporate income tax rate, and then they can pay paychecks to employees or even business owners. So there's this difference between the idea of ownership and control. Who owns the company versus who controls the company. So owners of large corporations rarely control them, right? You as a stockholder are not involved in the decisions of whoever you hold stock in, most likely. You're not making the decisions of Apple. You're not making the decisions of Samsung. You're not making the decisions of Google, right? Or I guess Alphabet's what they go by with their stock ticker. Though you may own your own small section of this company, that doesn't necessarily you're the person who controls them. Most corporations have a board. This board can have a president, it can have a COO, it can have a CEO, it can have a CFO, it can have CO. There's lots of different things, right? There's different pieces that make up this board that have a lot of control in the decision-making process. Because there's a separation in between who actually owns the company and who is making the decisions of the company, that means that sometimes there might be a disconnect, right? Sometimes the people who are running the company might say, oh, you know, if I do really well this year, I get a bonus. So even though this may not be in the best interest of the stockholders who are thinking about their long-term performance 40 years from now, I plan to retire within 40 years. So instead, I'm going to make decisions that help the company now for my own personal gain. This might be at the best interest of the person who's controlling the company, but maybe not at the best interest of the person who owns the company, who might be worried about profits in 40 years or long-term sustainability over time. This misalignment of the interest in between the owners and the managers of firms, these are called agency problems. So this is something that I've seen a few of you allude to on your papers so far. Agency problems are just when the people who control the company may not necessarily make the decisions that are in the best interest of business owners. That's why we try to do lots of things to kind of give them a stake in the game, such as giving them part of their retirement in stocks for the company, so that they're sort of a partial owner too, and they'll want to make decisions that encourage long-term growth. We might give them different sort of performance-based measures or bonuses that are based upon if they act in a way that would be best for the business owners. So managers may buy jets or other items for their own pleasure. I just realized I misspelled buy. Sorry about that. I'll fix that. Rather than try to improve the company, while the people who own the company might want, instead of fancy jets or all these other sort of things, for us to invest in maybe long-term clean or green solutions to make us more energy efficient, to save money in the long run. Not as hot and flashy of a decision to make as a really cool swanky jumbo jet, but it might be what's in the best interest. So detecting and preventing this agency problem behavior, where the people who control or manage the company don't necessarily act in the same capacity as owners or as the owners would like, can be especially difficult. So with this, we also need to know a little bit about how firms are financed, right? So firms need money, and we get some of this by having equity finance. Equity finance is when you have stocks and you raise funds by selling off these partial bits of ownership of the firm or these stocks to different people. Then you have money that comes in that you can use for decisions and investments that people are able to pull out at later times when maybe you've made money on top of that. That's one way. So that's equity financing. Then there's the idea of debt financing. Sometimes when a business needs money very quickly, they can raise this money by borrowing from lenders or banks or selling bonds. If you're unaware of what bonds are, they're just promises by corporations to make periodic interest payments. You lend me $100 today, and I guarantee I will pay you 112 next year as long as I'm still doing all right. Then there's the idea of retained earnings. So any net profit that's kept by the company instead of paid out to the owners is things that we can continue to make decisions on or use within the company. What does this mean? Okay, let's say a company makes $100 billion. Well, they might want to reward their stock owners, right? Or the people who have these shares of the firm. So they might say, well, 40 millions of this, I'm going to divide out across the number of shares, and then I'm going to write a little bonus check to everybody. And they're going to get their money in the mail that represents the money that they're going to make that I'm wanting to share with them because we had a good year. Sometimes there's also retained earnings though. I've made this money and I've decided to reinvest it back into my own business, right? So investors who buy shares in a company can be rewarded by those dividends. Those payments are part of profits that go directly to these individuals, or by capital gains. When my stock is worth way more than it was 2 years ago, so I decide to sell it, that additional amount that I've made above what my original cost was, so let's say maybe I bought a stock for $15 and now it's worth $25, that additional $10 that it made, that's called capital gains. Now that probably rings some bells in your head because we have things called capital gains tax in the United States. That means if I bought something for $15, sold it for $25, the capital gain is $10, I'm going to be taxed on that $10. So let's say firms want to finance an investment. They have one of two choices, right? They can either use retained earnings that they have, or they can try to raise money. So if they don't want to use the money that they have retained from previous periods, what they're going to do is they're going to try to raise money by one of two different ways. They can either issue bonds, so they go for debt financing where they try to get loans that they were able to pay back at a later rate for probably a set amount of interest, or they can issue shares of stock. This is called equity financing, and that's where shareholders, they can receive dividends, they can receive capital gains, and in exchange they have a partial ownership of this business. So why do we have a corporate tax? Why are we taxing these corporations? Well, that's the idea of kind of a pure profits taxation. If firms have market power, they earn pure profits. So if, for example, I'm the only person who makes smartphones, I'm getting just pure profits from making these smartphones, selling them out in the world, and this is money back on me. A tax on these pure profits, especially if you have a large amount of market power and a lot of control over the price of your good, it really has no distortions. But should we tax the economic or the accounting profit? So this is the really fun part, right? Because you remember there's differences in between accountants and economists. Economists, with our economic profit, we think about the difference in the firm's revenue versus its economic opportunity. Accounting profit is the idea of, hey, we have money in, money out. How are we thinking about our inventory? How are we scheduling which ones we're writing off? What's depreciation? These are accounting profits, is thinking about what the bank accounts look like and how we need to rectify those for the purpose of taxes. Economic profits are the idea of, hey, I might have made $100 million, and that's cool, but I could have made $200 million if I would have done this other thing. Maybe this isn't my most efficient outcome. What was my economic opportunity? I produced this, but I gave up an even better opportunity for me. Maybe my taxes or maybe my outcome should be adjusted based upon the fact that I made a bad take instead of a good take, or maybe because I did something altruistic as opposed to something else. Economic profits looks at the revenue, but just this opportunity cost. What else could I have done with my capital? What else could I have done with my labor? What else could I have done with my resources when producing? And it starts to make decisions based upon that. So we have that, and then we have this idea of retained earnings. So remember, businesses make money, or at least they try to. They try to make money, and with the additional money that they make each time, they have a choice. They can spend that money on dividends. They can give these little bonus checks to the people who are shareholders, which they will end up getting taxed on, or they can have retained earnings. They can continue to keep this money in their bank account to be able to use for future purchases and investments. If corporations were not taxed on their earnings, then the owners could avoid being taxed by just retaining their earnings, right? So this corporate income tax, they've made this money, they're supposed to be taxed on that amount. If we didn't tax on them, well, what would the business do? Let's say you work for this business and it's an incorporated business. For each dollar they make, it comes in. If they decide to retain this earnings and keep it in the bank account, they're going to get a corporate income tax on it. And then further down the line, you can write yourself a check as the business owner, and you're going to have an income tax that's associated with that. But what if we took away the tax on retained earnings? Then we have this dollar come in, and it's not taxed at all until you write a check to yourself and then it's taxed at an income tax or at your personal income tax rate. Well, then why would you ever move the money out of the company? The company can just buy your house. The company can just buy the company cars. The company can do these other things. If you allow the money to sit there as retained earnings without any amount of taxes taken out on it whatsoever, then business owners just avoid that personal income tax by having everything go through the corporation. So these retained earnings would essentially act as just interest-free savings, because it's savings that they have that they could make money on that aren't necessarily taxed until the time when they take it out. So they can allow it to gain money, they can save money there, and only take out what they really need for personal income, because the personal income tax rate would be the only thing affecting it, right? So if corporations paid out those earnings many years later, the present discounted value of the tax burden would be really, really low. Because if I'm just paying myself from my corporation, if I'm just paying myself what I need and nothing else, the tax burden would be very, very low, but there would also be almost no tax revenue, right? So these are things that we have to consider when we're making policy. Is that a good idea or not? What should this money be used for? So there's a lot of structure to corporate taxes. You already know that we've gone through the different steps of how to calculate personal income taxes, and we have similar things that happen with corporate income taxes. So the very, very, very basic way that we simulate this within economic models is to think of taxes as revenue minus expenses. So whatever our retained earnings are minus the expenses that we had that period times some sort of tax rate. Then we subtract out the tax credits, because there's lots of tax credits for businesses to try to incentivize them to do the right thing or do something that might bring marginal cost or marginal benefit more in line with social marginal cost and social marginal benefit. So we have a couple different pieces of this. Revenues. What are revenues? These are just what firms earn selling things in the market. I sell my good or product, and then therefore I make money. These are revenues. Then we have expenses, which are the cost of doing business, right? It's buying materials, it's paying interest payments, it's depreciation of all of my assets. So I have different expenses that I have on a routine basis. Rent. My oven not being worth as much for my really cool cookie factory if I've had the same oven for 10 years. I can't sell it off for the same amount. Maybe if I'm making interest payments on a loan I took out to buy that oven 10 years ago, right? Then we have this idea of depreciation. So I've already used that buzzword twice, but this is the idea, is the rate at which capital investment loses their value over time. If I buy this really cool $50,000 amazing oven, 10 years later, when it's beat up, barely working, and held together by duct tape, it is not worth that same $50,000. I cannot sell it for $50,000. Doesn't matter how cool it is. That's because the value of it depreciates over time. You see this with your cars. Each year you delay selling off your car, it depreciates in value, so it's actually worth less, right? The same thing happens with different sort of items that are pieces of capital that are bought by corporations. So we have to consider this depreciation. Accountants do it and economists do it when we start to consider the realities, right? So therefore, we also have to build in these things called depreciation allowances. And this is the amount of money that firms can deduct from their taxes to account for capital investment depreciation. If I have a giant oven that was originally worth $50,000 when I bought it, and now it's been 10 years and it's just not working very well, held together by duct tape, I'm losing value. I'm losing value by having this inefficient oven. So depreciation allowances are a way of kind of figuring out with my taxes an amount that I can subtract that accounts for the depreciation that's happening to my capital and the fact that I'm going to have to replace it over time. So economic depreciation and depreciation in practice are very varied, and I'm sure you've heard all about this in your intro to accounting class. And obviously I'm not an accountant, so I'm going to talk a little bit about economic depreciation as opposed to just accounting depreciation. Economic depreciation is supposed to represent kind of the true expense of something. What are we really seeing over time with the wear and tear each year? So there's two different ways that I can kind of rationalize this depreciation, right? Because it's very difficult to measure. I just told you over and over about a $50,000 oven that's held together by duct tape 10 years later, but what's it really actually worth at the end? Was it just when it started getting held together by duct tape in the last year that it lost value? Or was it just the old model 1 year in and nobody wanted it? So just 1 year in, it lost all of its value. Well, these are things we have to think about. How quickly does something that we own lose value? It's rarely ever linear. It's very rarely, you're worth $5,000 less each year. It's typically a function of something. We call these depreciation schedules. It's kind of the timetable in which these assets are depreciated. Does this oven have benefit for 10 years? For 10 years, is it at least worth more than zero? And is it worth a lot less the first year, or relatively the same after the first year, but that 10th year is just everything's out of the way? That depends. We have these depreciation schedules. Now, when we're thinking about expensing investments, things that we can deduct the entire cost of an investment in the year in which it's purchased, those are kind of nice, right? If I buy this $50,000 oven and then I can say it's worth nothing the next year, then there's a lot that I can write off on my taxes, because that's a very significant depreciation in a very short period of time, which kind of makes it more valuable to us because it's more of a write-off that we can have, right? So deductions claimed sooner tend to be more valuable from an economic perspective over time. Go forward. Okay, so it's just a little bit about business taxes. We're not going super deep into any of these. If you want to, though, like, let me know. I will talk to you all day long about taxes. But that was a little bit of the corporate income taxes, just so you can have an idea about what that looks like or what businesses are even considering. Now let's talk a little bit about taxes on wealth. So taxes on wealth are ones that kind of affect things that are not necessarily just your income, right? So wealth is your income plus what things do you own? What investments do you have? What sort of savings accounts do you have? What sort of estate did you get left behind from the rich, twice estranged uncle and aunt that died under mysterious circumstances or something? We have these different pieces of wealth that may not necessarily look like income. So what do we do with those, or how do we treat them? Well, let's start with a provoking thought, or at least go into sort of an idea, right? So in June 2006, which I know was a hot minute ago, Warren Buffett, who's this really rich person, which is why we kind of listen to him on all of his different advice. Come here. It's the last time we're making a video for the students. You may as well say hi. Stormy says hello. She believes in you. She thinks you're going to do awesome on your presentations, and she thinks you're going to do awesome on your final papers and on your final exam, because she is a good luck cat. So you have been blessed by the good luck cat. Enjoy. So in 2006, Warren Buffett, who's the second richest man, he made this shocking announcement to everybody. And this kind of like blew up in the news. They're like, how should we treat inheritance? But he made this investment that he was giving up 85% of his shares in Berkshire Hathaway to 5 different foundations. And he was going to donate a vast majority of his wealth to charity instead of giving it to his own children. Which this seemed to accumulate with Buffett's longstanding advocacy against the transfer of large estates. Warren Buffett has this idea that people should make their own wealth and work their own way, not necessarily that vast giant fortunes should just be given to the next person in line to have a vast giant fortune. Instead, he believes in having a reduced amount that would go to the next level, right? So in keeping with this position, Buffett, along with a whole bunch of other wealthy Americans, have been very outspoken about different people who want to critique repeals of estate taxes or taxes that are levied on large estates upon the death of their owners. They have a lot of opinions on what's actually right. Now, it's not our job in this class to decide what's right and wrong. What it is to understand what the different perspectives are. And some people do believe that there should be, 100% estate tax, and everything should either be donated or it should be given to the government, and children should have nothing and start from their own place and build their own fortune. There's the other idea of thinking that old money is new money, and give everything that you possibly can to the next generation, and there should be no taxes on it whatsoever, and they should continue with this family dynasty without having taxes upon death. These are the two extreme opinions, and there's lots of ones that are in between as well. So with Buffett, he argued that allowing children to inherit all their parents' riches caused them to be spoiled. It sapped all their motivation. It kind of ruined the meritocracy of working hard for what you get and having a reward from it. Many others have defended that estate taxes also have issues for progressivity, right? They note that because of the high exemption levels, and there's lots of things that you can exempt upon estate taxes, the tax affects only a small portion of the wealthiest citizens upon death, instead of, you know, just the millionaires, affecting billionaires and multi-billionaires, but not necessarily as much millionaires or people who might have smaller pools of wealth that are still completely different starts in socioeconomic status compared to other families, right? So opponents of estate taxes also argue that it's, so these are the people who are okay with estate taxes, you know, like maybe let's tax it, maybe let's try to do some good with this. Then there's opponents of estate tax who are like, this is double taxation. When you made this money, you already got taxed on it, whether it was income or whether it was capital gains, you've already got taxed on this. And then you die and you're going to get taxed again. And that's a lot of their argument, is that this kind of creates a death tax or a double taxation on the same dollar. So they view it as kind of a government penalty for the act of dying itself. So why do we even have wealth tax to begin with? Or why do we even debate this? So let's talk about some of the arguments for and against the estate taxes, the taxes that happen upon your death when they have to process your estate. Well, the first question is, why tax wealth rather than income? Well, because of the differences, right? There's some families who have low amounts of savings because they have low amounts of income. So a majority of what they make is income, and they can put this income into savings or consumption. And if we tax on income, we tax on almost everything they make in a month. On the other hand, we have wealthy families who, though they might make income, if they've had substantiated wealth for generations, they also have a large pool of investments. This large pool of investments makes these capital gains. These large pools of investments also make dividends from stocks. So this person, for what they're making in a month, part of it's going to come from income, and then part of it's going to come from returns on wealth. So if you only tax the income, then there's a smaller portion of this person's money that's getting taxed, rather than the family that's entirely income, then a larger portion of their income is getting taxed. So that's kind of a disagreement among people, is how should we treat that? Is income and wealth identical? Is income and wealth substantially different? How should they be treated? Taxing wealth is kind of an extremely progressive means of raising revenue, right? It's trying to make it so that low socioeconomic families who have only income are treated similar to those with high wealth accumulation over years, and trying to raise money through this wealth and income, so that they're treated with similar percentages of their ultimate wealth being used for the purpose of tax revenues. Some people also believe that it's necessary to avoid the excess concentration of wealth and power in a few wealthy dynasties. It's the idea that if we have no estate taxes, lots of money gets invested by one individual family, and since they don't use that money very quickly, they raise money in the next period, and then their wealth continues to go up and up, and never really declines, right? So it causes concentration pockets of wealth, which a lot of people are unhappy about, right? Then it also allows children of wealthy families to just inherit all of their parents' wealth, which means that they never have to work, or they never have to do things that might be required in order to gain this level of affluency. So that's kind of some of the arguments that people have for estate tax. Then there's people who are on the other side who also have arguments against estate tax, and they think the idea is like, estate tax is double taxation. You got taxed on this money when you make it. Why are you getting taxed on it again when you die? All right. So the estate tax is fairly common. It's used amongst many different countries. And then we also have the idea of, is this the only version of double taxation? So notice we had said earlier, if you have an incorporated business, if a dollar comes into that incorporated business, it's taxed with the corporate income tax rate. Then you write yourself a check as the owner, and then you have the personal income tax rate. That's a double taxation. Or let's say you want to buy something. Let's say that I want to buy a cup of tea. Well, then the amount of money that I make on my paycheck, that is taxed at the personal income tax rate. Then when I buy this cup of coffee or cup of tea, whichever I decide to have at the time, that's also going to be taxed at a sales tax rate, right? So there's different forms of double taxation that happens. And when we have wealth taxes, it doesn't necessarily reduce savings, right? What we found is that dynasty families or families with really, really high income levels are still going to save regardless of if you put in an additional tax upon death or not. So there's a lot of moral contradictions in this, right? Is it appropriate to tax people upon their death? Some people disagree, and some people think it's a good idea. And that's really where we've been in the literature so far. There's very strong opinions on both sides, and it's something that we have to think about as public economists, because if you ever go into municipal government, you have to just make some of these decisions about what does estate taxes look like. If you decide to go to law school, you're going to have to know about probate court, or what does it necessarily mean to have these sort of estates pass on, and what happens to them. So this is something that unfortunately happens to everybody, right? Everybody dies eventually, which means that the treatment of the estate tax is something that needs to be figured out, because it's not something that can be avoided, right? You can't just avoid dying forever. And there's also administrative difficulties with putting in an estate tax, right? So to even afford the tax at all, you might have to sell some of the assets. So if someone in your family died and they gave you their house, well, that's going to go to probate court, which is expensive because you have to have lawyers, and then it's expensive because you have to file paperwork and take time off work. And then you're going to have taxes that are associated with that estate tax as well. So even though they left you a house, not physical money, you might end up having to sell the house to be able to afford not only the legal fees, but the taxes that come along with it, which means that you're not actually given the house. You might lose the house in the form of probate court. So these are things to think about, especially because property itself, which is one very common thing to be given or transferred during the estate process or the probate process, also has its own tax form, right? And that's the idea of property taxes. So what are property taxes? It's the tax that you have on the land that you live on, and any structures upon it. So this in itself is also a form of wealth tax, because these are things that people own that can accumulate in value over time. And it's a major source of revenue for local government. So if you remember, we've talked about different levels, right? At our national level, we bring in a lot of money from corporate income taxes. We bring in a lot of money from income taxes, and from different sort of Social Security revenues, right? Then at the state level, we have a lot of that same, a lot that's transferred from the federal government. But what about the municipalities? How does the city of Edwardsville raise the money to be able to pay for the local school district? Well, a lot of it's through property taxation, right? It's a tool that's used by local governments in order to raise money to finance local government, to finance the school system, to finance lots of things that happen on the municipal level. This property tax is just the tax that's levied on the value of the real estate, which also includes land and structures. The tax burden is typically based on assessed property value. So once every couple of years, someone will come by a home that you own. They'll look at it. They'll kind of assess the property value. They'll be like, 6 windows. 3 bathrooms. Fire hydrant. Some other sort of difference that's on this land. And then they assess what this property value is worth. They report it to the city. The city determines some percentage of that you're going to have taxed against. So maybe your home's worth $110,000, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're paying taxes on $110,000, depending on where you live. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's a reduced amount. Assessment ratios, that ratio of the amount of your assessed value of your home that you're actually taxed on, can vary widely. I'm actually from Columbia, South Carolina, so it's kind of fun to have a statistic. That's the lowest in the country. If you have a $100,000 house in Columbia, South Carolina, you're paying your property taxes on 4% of your assessed value. So your property taxes are on $4,000, right? That's very low. And surprisingly, we didn't have bad schools. The schools were actually pretty nice. But then we also have the other extreme of in Providence, Rhode Island. If your home's worth $100,000, you're taxed on that entire $100,000. So these are things to consider when you're deciding where you want to live and where you want to move. Many of you are about to get new jobs in the next year or 2 or 4, depending on what stage you're at. But you're about to get new jobs and go into your exciting new life. And when you move there, you're going to have to think, do I want to live in the city? Do I want to live in a suburb? Do I want to live on one side of the border or the other? And what does the property taxes look like? Because this is a bill that you get on an annual basis, which is considered a wealth tax. And notice that this is assessed property value. That means that someone can come out every few years and see how much your property value has gone up, the accumulation of the property value. So who really bears the property tax? Is it the property owners? Is it the financing companies? it really depends. So there's a couple different views on the incidence of property taxes, because a lot of people heavily debate this because it's a form of wealth tax, but it's not as salient as others, right? I can see that my stock goes up and down. I can see that my savings does well or doesn't do well. But what about property? Well, there's three views on the incidence of property tax. First is kind of the traditional partial equilibrium, right? Property tax falls on the landowners who own the structures, right? And owners and users, depending on their elasticity. How much can they actually just walk away if property taxes go up? If property taxes go up, do I just move to the Missouri side? That's something to consider, right? So we have our traditional partial equilibrium where we only care about that market. But a lot of people think about the general equilibrium part, because what we have to think about is this raised money goes somewhere, right? And it's the idea of capital taxes. So taxes reduce the return on capital, which means, okay, if I have this really nice house in the suburbs, but it's a really, really high property tax rate, then the amount of money that I'm going to make for this property goes down, because lots of people don't want to move somewhere that's going to have an extremely high tax rate, which means that it's going to make all the high income people leave town, all the high wealth people leave town, because they're like, oh, I know I don't want to pay this on an annual basis, which means that the tax really falls on whoever owns the capital in that location. Then there's the idea of it being a benefits tax. So property taxes finance local government spending, which are beneficial to homeowners. So yeah, there's a lot of property taxes in Edwardsville, Illinois, but what there also is in Edwardsville, Illinois, is a very strong municipal government that has beautiful parks and great functioning schools and lots of very interesting and wonderful things on the local level, right? So maybe these taxes do exist, but we also need to consider the idea that there might be benefits that are associated with it that might raise and increase the value of houses. Yes, you might be taxed more, but your home value goes up by 3% if there's a park within walking distance to you. If all of a sudden where you live has a whole bunch of parks, that's actually going to raise your property value. So what does that look like relative to these taxes? In Tibu equilibriums, which if you remember we talked about quite a few chapters ago, that means that there'd be no real burden of taxation as long as the benefits were in the same location as where the taxes happened and if they were of roughly equal value. So there's different types of property taxes, right? And there's two important distinctions in the levying of property taxes. First is the idea of, is this residential or is this a business? This is, well, it's not my home, I rent. It's my landlord's home, right? Which is a residential home. There's going to be some amount of taxes on that. And that's going to be very different, right? Because I do not have any sort of factory in here. I do not have any sort of business that I conduct in here. I mean, I record classes, but I could do that in the office or I could do that here. This is not my business, right? But there are businesses. If we go up and down Main Street, yeah, sure, there's like some loft style apartments on top of a lot of the businesses, but for the most part, everything on Main Street tends to be businesses that are used for raising revenues. So we have to think about how the taxes are treated in between these two different places. Some argue that encouraging economic development and business is good, right? So maybe we should lower the taxes on business so that we can bring more high functioning businesses who are going to make money and employ people and bring money to the local economy into an area. And that's a lot of the argument in between these sort of business income taxes. Then we also have the idea of land improvement, right? So what is the difference between land and improvements, right? Land is inelastic. We have so much land. I mean, technically it's inelastic. We kind of get less of it each year as water levels rise, but for the most part, it's inelastic. I can't magically make more land in Edwardsville. Not going to happen, right? So if we go back to the idea of who bears the burden of the tax, all the way back in the tax incident chapter, we see that a lot of the time what we want to put the taxes on are inelastic goods. We love putting them on inelastic goods because that means that there's no deadweight loss. So the land should be taxed, right? But what about the structures? So it's very hard to separate land value from structure value. If I have a giant open acre field that's pretty, I mean, there's some value to that. If I put a really cool farm on it and I put in a basement and I put in a distillery or something, I don't know, a whole bunch of other things, well, that's going to have some value. The value of this property is going to change because that's something that comes with it, even though those structures are not inelastic, right? They can come or go. So it's hard to separate the land value of the land itself from the structure value. There is this idea of like Ricardian rents, which was first proposed in the 1700s and 1800s. And it came up to the idea that maybe we should tax only land. But land's an interesting thing to try to only tax for, right? Because then how do you tax a high rise in New York City? And it's a very small amount of land that it's actually on, but it's extremely, extremely competitive for people wanting to get into the structure of it. So how do we deal with the taxes? So let's think about property tax breaks for businesses, right? Because these are things that we have to think about, because we just saw we would like to bring in businesses that have economic value. So do you all remember the fight when a bunch of different places applied to try to get the Amazon second headquarters there, like Amazon HQ2? And different places are doing wild things. They were like, we won't tax you for 10, 20 years. We will name an entire town after you, or an entire city after you. A whole bunch of different things, right? People really wanted Amazon HQ2 there. And one of the main reasons that they wanted to get people there is because of jobs. It'd create jobs, it'd create value, it'd create lots of people being there. So they wanted to exchange tax breaks because they saw this as being a really good value for the people within these areas. So property tax breaks for businesses, they're kind of ambiguous and they're kind of random, and it's kind of dependent by the place, right? Let's think of a couple examples. Boeing. Okay, the state of Washington, because Boeing was like, nope, we're tired of this. We got our like Charleston area, and you're taxing us too much, so we're gonna leave. And then the state of Washington was like, please don't leave. You bring so many jobs. Like tens of thousands of people will be unemployed if you leave. How about let's make this $8.7 billion deal, and you can stay. We're gonna give you some discounts on your taxes. And that's one thing that happened. It ended up being a $3.2 billion deal much earlier, and then it became like this larger deal in the next phase. Anyways, that's something that they negotiated because they knew that they brought an economic value to the state. There's another one for the Alcoa deal in New York. To keep Alcoa there, that was a $5.6 million deal. Wisconsin outbid 6 other states in convincing Foxconn to come there, and it was because they gave them tax breaks. So when we have this new business that comes in, like Amazon HQ2, what happens? Wages go up. When wages go up, property value goes up because people start fixing their homes, and there tends to be competitiveness for the jobs there. And these wages and property values rise faster in cities that successfully attract industrial plants, or ones that are going to hire people, suggesting that property tax breaks for these businesses might actually be really valuable when we look at the social marginal benefit of it. But there's no benefit to the United States as a whole, right? So if cities compete to get a business there, that's great for that city, but that's not looking at the national level. How is this affecting us, right? Because this is a national class. We're thinking about what happens to the United States. If there's giant tax breaks trying to get a business in between Missouri and Illinois, well, it's not going to affect how well off the United States is. It actually just means less tax revenue, probably, right? So these are things that we have to think about when we have these businesses that we are considering tax breaks for. All right, well, with that was a little bit about wealth taxes, a little bit about business taxes. I hope that sets you up for some really cool ideas and perspectives of knowing what the next stage is. Like I said before, it's been really great working with you this semester. I'm excited to hear all your projects after the break. I hope any of you that are graduating find your dream job and you're really happy. If you need any help or connections, please let me know. I'd be happy to help you. Any of you who are continuing on for a few more years, I hope to see you in later classes. So I teach 445. I hope to see you there next fall if you're still around, and it might be really fun. With that, let me know if there's anything I can do for you. I am always here to try to help you be successful in your lives and in getting jobs. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Have a great one.